Amen. We are continuing on our study on the life of Elijah, how we take our next steps in growing in godliness. So far, we've been watching God take an ordinary guy named Elijah the Tishbite and transform him into a man of God. Some of the things we've been learning, and you might start turning to 1 Kings chapter 18 so you can be there in your Old Testament. We're going to land in that chapter, and we're going to spend a lot of time there this morning. What we've learned so far in chapter 17, the very first thing we saw is that God uses the ordinary to accomplish the extraordinary. Elijah wasn't some super saint. He didn't have some kind of supernatural powers that made him this supernatural hero. He was an ordinary guy from an ordinary place, just like everyone in this room. That means all of us are qualified for God to be on display in our story. For God to do extraordinary things if just us ordinary folk would allow God to do the extraordinary. And for God to do that in our lives, He takes us on a journey, just like He did Elijah. He called him out of his little old hometown in the rugged mountains of Tishba, there into the ministry to declare the truth of God in all the world. God has called you to be a minister. You say, no, I've never surrendered to a call to the ministry. Well, 2 Corinthians tells us every one of us has been reconciled to God through Christ. And when that happens, when we become a Christian, He then gives us the ministry of reconciliation. That's what we see Elijah living out, this ministry of reconciliation. And before he can be who he needs to be in this world, he next had to go to Kerith. Kerith was an isolated place, a place where God took him out of the palace, took him to a place where he would be allowed to humble himself, to be broken and learn dependence on God. After Kerith, we looked in and saw that God then next deepens us by purifying our walk, just like we learned at Zarephath, that place where they purified precious metals. The same thing they did in that city is what God would do in Elijah's heart next. He would bring up to the surface all those things that fell short of the glory of God, those things that would not honor the Lord. And God did a deepening work in Elijah's life by purifying his heart. Next, we saw that as he was there at Zarephath, that he experienced a number of tough and difficult situations. That life is like that. Between any two mountaintops, there's always what's between the mountains? Valley times. And after you get to the next mountaintop experience, what do you find is going to come next? Another season of valleys, what we would call lower times or more difficult times. Those are the deepening times in a person's life. So far, that's where we left off in the journey, as God would reveal His will to Elijah one day at a time. As we look in on Elijah's story, his story is not any different than yours. The opportunity is the same for you as it was for Elijah. Will you allow a supernatural God to do the supernatural in your life? But what I've discovered is that we human beings are just like our automobiles. Apart from the Spirit of God working in us, we all naturally drift out of alignment. If you've owned a car, driven a car very long, especially on the streets of Oklahoma City, you can find the best mechanic. You can do that high-dollar front-end alignment, and it won't be 15 minutes later and 5 potholes later that you find your car drifting out of alignment. Well, the same is true with human beings, with us who walk with God. If we're not careful, we can just kind of process life and find ourselves drifting off track and out of alignment with God. You realize that just 1 degree off course will eventually end you up in a ditch? Well, as we wake up in 1 Kings 18, we find that all of Israel is now out of alignment with God, and they're now in the ditch. And God is going to raise up Elijah to speak into that moment and to help them get out of the ditch and back to the course which God has for them. What does that look like? Go to verse 17 now, 1 Kings chapter 18. Remember, it's been 3 to 5 years that there has been a drought in the land. There is a great famine now that has taken place, and all because Elijah spoke the truth to the king that there would be no rain in the land, so he could prove that God of their world, Baal, the fertility god, the one who sends their rain, was a false god. They now wake up 3 to 5 years later in this famine. Elijah is not popular in the land, and certainly with Ahab. Ahab, who's supposed to be taking care of the people, the king is to provide for the nation, can't provide for his people. His people are starving. There's disease in the land. There's famine, and he is not popular with the people. All of a sudden, Elijah comes out from hiding and appears back at the palace. And guess who he sees first? Ahab. And when Ahab saw Elijah, he called for all of the kingdom to come together and to celebrate the return of Elijah. Is that what you would expect? No, quite the opposite. Look at his return. He simply cried out at Elijah, yelled out at him, "Is this you, the troubler of Israel?" Elijah responded and said, "I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed the Baals." As you look in on this story, this reunion of Elijah going back to the palace, we find Ahab labeling Elijah the troubler. That word troubler in the Hebrew actually translates viper, a poisonous snake. And that's how Ahab saw Elijah. All of his problems was because Elijah had prophesied over their kingdom this drought. And what we find in Ahab is the reality of what can happen as you live in this world. That if you're not careful, your reality can be greatly distorted by your context and by your culture. He has drawn a conclusion that his problem is Elijah. Well, that's why the Apostle Paul wrote in Ephesians 6:12 that your battle is not with people or flesh and blood. It is with the viper, Satan, who appeared like a serpent in the garden, that viper who comes to kill, steal, and destroy. Ahab thought his problem was Elijah. You may be thinking your problem is a parent or a teacher who gives too much homework, or it could be a sibling that you live with, or your problem is the government, or your problem is your boss, or your problem, and everybody puts a face on their problem. The problem is you're being deceived by the true viper, the one who kills, steals, and destroys families, and kills, steals, and destroys relationships. And we have to return to the reality of where the real battle lies. And Elijah is going to step into that battle. And I want you to know he doesn't draw a sword against Ahab, the most wicked king that Israel had ever known. His battle wasn't with Ahab. His battle was in the spiritual realm. And so is yours, and so is mine. So how do we engage in that battle? Well, first of all, we have to realize the spiritual blindness that is the reality of this world. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, we've looked at it before. I'll put it on the screen. Look at verses 3 through 6. Paul said, if our gospel is veiled, in other words, if people can't see it, if they are blind to our gospel, it's to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world, the viper, Satan, has blinded their minds so that they can't believe, so that they may not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who's in the image of God. Paul went on to say, for we don't preach ourselves. We don't preach, hey, you need to be a Baptist. We don't preach, hey, listen to Paul or listen to Bill. He said, we preach Christ Jesus as Lord, and we ourselves as your bondservants for Jesus' sake. For God who said, light shall shine out of darkness, is the one who is shown in our hearts to give that light, the light of the knowledge and the glory of God in the face of Christ. Paul said what Elijah would demonstrate in 1 Kings 18. Paul would preach the reality that the darker the world becomes, the darker the day in which we live, the brighter God's light gets to shine. And that light is capital L. It stands for Jesus, the one who saved you, the Spirit of Christ who lives in you, and now seeks to shine through you. Elijah, as we're about to study his life, it wasn't Elijah's light that we're seeing. It was God's light shining through Elijah, who had surrendered in obedience to God's will for his life. So let's go back and see, what does that look like? How do we model the light of God in a dark world? Go back to 1 Kings 18 and verse 18. The first thing we see here is Elijah speaking truth, even though the culture was living a lie. The culture believed Elijah was the problem. The culture couldn't see it was everything they embraced that had caused problems in their land. And as he was accused and said, I have not troubled Israel, O king, but you and your father's house have, because you've forsaken the commandments of the Lord. You have brought in this idolatry, this worship of the Baals. And so he says, let's settle this once and for all. Verse 19. Now then, send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, and together with your 450 prophets of Baal, and your 400 prophets of the Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. King Ahab had invited the gods of his wife, Jezebel, into the nation of Israel. They had set up all these false areas of worship throughout all the land. They had pushed God out. Does that sound like America to you today? Very similar today. And as we look at this reality, we find God raising up an Elijah in the darkest hour of the nation's history. As I watch the news, as I watch history unfold in America today, I'm not a doomsday prophet, but I would say there has never been a greater need for the spirit of Elijah in America today than ever before in our nation's history. That while things seem to get darker and we invite more and more things in that are not of God, we find the reality that the people of God need to take a stand for truth. As we look in on this story, we find the reality, these realities. Number one, as Elijah takes a stand, he doesn't stand against Ahab, but he stands for truth. He doesn't come after the king, he comes after the hearts of the people. That as he takes his stand, he does that by confronting the lies of his culture with the truth of God's word. Not the preferences of his culture, not the opinions of his king, not the reality of what had been legislated, not the reality of what was accepted, but he simply stood for what was true. As we look in on this story, we're reminded that taking a stand is never easy. I certainly think about our teenagers and our young people in our student ministry. I think about what they have to stand up for or what they fall against each and every day. And I understand you are perceived to be the minority as you walk the hallways of your classrooms, as you live out your faith on campus. But I want you to understand, as I look out here, in 1 Kings 18, I see one who's taken a stand. As I look out on our youth group, I can see literally more than one that could come together to make a difference. But not just our young people, moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas. Taking a stand is never popular. We're going to see why that is true. But here was the reality. In verse 19, here's the math. There were 850 false prophets, a king and a queen, and all of them have led the nation astray against Elijah. Do the math. 852, and more than that, the whole nation against one man. What can that one man do? Well, maybe we need to relook at the math, and maybe we need to realize it wasn't just Elijah who was standing there. It was Elijah standing there in the power of God. That Elijah plus God equals the majority, no matter what the opposition may add up to. Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. You don't have to turn there, but it's on the screen. It says, "Enter through the narrow gate. The gate is wide." We looked at this verse just a few weeks ago. And be reminded of God's math and the reality of what is perceived majority and where that majority would lead you, or the perceived minority. Narrow is the gate. It's wide, and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and many people are on it. I would tell you, if most people are doing it, it's probably because it's destructive. I would tell you, if most people think it's the way to go, it's probably that wide path that will ultimately lead to destruction. And if we're going to be a nation that is governed by what is popular, we are heading down the wrong path. We must take a different road. You must take a different road. We must take the different road. And what is that different road? Verse 14. "For there is a gate which is small, its way is narrow that leads to life, and there are very few who find it." The question today is, whose math are you going to live by? Are you going to live by the majority that are walking down a wide path of destruction? Or are you willing to be the minority? Do you have to sing the same song that everyone else is singing and go the same places everyone else is going? Or are you willing to be a modern day Elijah? Part of the problem with our country today is we have been passive. And we've done what Israel did, which we just sat on the sidelines, and we let this flood of secularism sweep in on a nation that once was one nation under God, who said, "In God we trust." And now we wake up today, and the last thing we want anything to do with is a holy God. We've embraced every form of darkness that a nation could embrace. We have not denied a single sin on the shores of this land. And while we may want to blame it on a president or a Congress or a Supreme Court, I want you to know it falls at the doorstep of the people of God. For Elijah, while he is speaking to Ahab, is also addressing the people of Israel. He wasn't addressing the false nations that lived around them that brought in the false gods. He was holding the people of God accountable. And so as we learn from this story, let's be sure that we realize the reality is this: one believer surrendered to a holy God, 1 plus God equals the majority. For greater is He that's in you than he that's in the world. And it's time that we learn that reality and that we learn to be as bold as Brother Sean's pants. Anybody seen Brother Sean's pants today? You need to take a peek at those critters, all right? And as bold as those puppies are, what if we were even more bold? What if we took on the spirit of Elijah? Well, what does that look like? Here's what I know is this: those who stand on the truth are always the ones left standing. Did you hear what I just said? Those who stand on the truth and for the truth, representing the way, the truth, and life, will always be the last ones standing. Now, if we look at it through the natural, if we look at a whole nation that was against Elijah, if we see a king and a queen that were wicked and hated Elijah, 850 prophets against one prophet, who would you put your money on? Baptists don't bet now. But who would you put your money on? I'm putting it on the king, aren't you? He's got the power. I'm putting it where the numbers are, aren't you? And you watch what God does through Elijah. What's he do? Verse 19. Now then, this is Elijah speaking. Go and gather to me all of Israel at Mount Carmel. Bring your prophets, and the ones who eat at Jezebel's table. Verse 20. So Ahab sent a message among all the sons of Israel. He brought those prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people, and he declared. Underline this next phrase. Look at what he said to the people, not to the king. He said it to the people of God, Israel. How long will you hesitate between two opinions? Part of the problem in our country today, again, is not legislation being passed by our Congress. It's what we, the church, are allowing to happen by hesitating between two opinions. Worshiping God supposedly on Sunday, but living like anything else Monday through Saturday. Hesitating between two opinions. He said, if the Lord is God, then follow Him. If it's Baal, follow him. Make up your minds, people. Don't you dare live a Falls Creek reality of 1 week of summer, giving your life to God, and then coming back and then living however else you want to live and serving the other gods of your friends in this world. Moms and dads, let's not drag our kids to church and call it Christianity and not live it every day we wake up. Elijah threw down on his own people and said, hey, it's our problem. The problem is this: we've allowed the viper, Satan, to allow us to live after two opinions. That is the definition of hypocrisy. I actually call it spiritual schizophrenia, where on one day we show up and put on our Baptist smile, and the rest of the day we put on our worldly smile. He called them out. He said, you're straddling the fence, trying to land on both sides. If you've ever seen a little kid trying to walk a fence line, we get the phrase straddling the fence. You know why we came up with that phrase? You ever watch a little kid walking down that little fence line, and all of a sudden both feet slip and their legs land on both sides of the fence? You know what happens to that little kid? A lot of pain. A lot of pain. And that's what we try to do as we live this journey. We put one foot on Sunday mornings in, and then we leave church and we try to put our foot and act like everyone else and wonder why in the world is life so painful. How long are you going to hesitate between the two opinions? The truth of God's Word or the lies that this world lives by? He called them out. And He called them out to take their stand with Him. We take a look at this passage in 1 Kings 18, 20 through 21, and we find that when we live according to the world's ways, it robs us of our love for God. Israel, who once marched out of Egypt boldly, once who praised God for their deliverance, once who finally embraced the promised land, now wake up and they want nothing to do with God. Why? Because they embraced other things. The same thing is true in your journey and mine. If I embrace anything else into my life, if I passionately pursue the things of this world, it will rob me of my first love, my love for God. You can't hesitate between two opinions. Also, we find that it makes us indifferent in the end. Look at verse 21 again. Go back to verse 21. When Elijah said, choose today, how long are you going to hesitate? Which one are you going to serve, God or Baal? Look at their answer, verse 21. And the people answered him, how? With silence. I'm not making this up. What happened in Elijah's day is exactly what I see happening in our day. When we are called to choose between a holy God and His ways and the unholy ways of this world, it seems to me the majority of the church, I'm not slamming PCB, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about the church in general. Believers in America today seem to be remaining silent. And if we stay silent, if we continue just to gather together on Sunday mornings and play church, we will watch our nation crumble at its foundations. What happened in Israel will happen among us. But let's look at the rest of the story because there's something even better that begins to happen. Elijah draws all the people together and he confronts them about the reality that they have fallen under the spell of darkness, that they were remaining silent, thinking they could live one way, declaring the name of God, but living after the Baals, the false gods that they had embraced. They were cloaked in darkness and they couldn't even see it. It's kind of like going to a movie theater. You know when you go into a movie theater? Now this isn't as dramatic as it might be because there's some light on the screen. But as soon as those lights went off, your ability to see was diminished. Now the reality is this, that the longer we stay in this darkness, the brighter all of a sudden the room becomes. But the longer we stay right here, right where we are, what was so dramatically dark just a minute ago is starting to become a little more comfortable. I mean, look around the room. You can even pick out some features of some people's faces. You can see a little better than just a minute ago. And the longer we stay in this darkness, the more comfortable we become in the darkness. We're adapting, we're adjusting, and pretty soon this just becomes a real comfortable place to be. Let's go ahead and bring the lights on. We need to get back to Scripture. I want you to be able to see it. Take a look at it. Doesn't it help having a little light? Come on. Verse 22. Let's get some light. So Elijah said to the people, I alone am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. So now, here's what we're going to do. Now, I could read you all these scriptures, and we'll post them up on the screen, but here's the story. He basically calls a showdown between the lying prophets of Ahab and Jezebel and his one true God. He said, what we're going to do is we're going to build an altar here. You can go first. You'll get 2 oxen. You can put them on there just like you do in your false worship. I'll do in my living worship. And whoever's sacrifice is received by the true God, that God will send down fire consuming that sacrifice. He tells them what the rules are. He says, you guys can go first. Matter of fact, you can pick out the oxen. You can control every part of this challenge. And let's prove who the one true God is. Look at the last part of verse 24. It said, then you call on the name of your God, I'll call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, then he will prove that he is the one true God. And all the people said, this is a good idea. Now, all of a sudden they speak up. Isn't that interesting? They've remained silent, and now all of a sudden they're like, okay, cool. You want to play this game, Elijah? We got the majority, and we're going to throw down on you. Elijah said, let's prove it. And so they have the battle royal there on Mount Carmel. Way before WWE, we had WW Elijah. How cool is this? And he's going to jump in the ring, and he's going to do an atomic knee drop like nobody has ever done before. He's going to put the death clamp on the prophets of Elijah, and he's going to demonstrate who the one true God is. So now, you get down to verses 25 and 27, and he says, you boys go first. And so it says here that they took the ox, they prepared it, they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. And they cried out, "O Baal, answer us. Prove that you're the one true God." They cried out for hour after hour after hour. Verse 27, this is good stuff. Take a look at it. Go to verse 27. You're going to like this. It came about at noon, after many hours of this mockery, that Elijah then mocked these prophets. We call it smack talk. Look at it. He said to them, "Why don't you cry out a little louder? For he is a god, and either he's occupied or gone aside. Maybe he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep. And he just needs to wake up." So after he sits back on the sidelines, he's waiting his chance to get in the ring. He's watching these 850 idiots crying out to this false god who they know doesn't really exist. And they're crying out and they're yelling for Baal to answer, and hour after hour their lie is revealed. And so Elijah steps in. I love this part of Elijah. Elijah's like some of you that are real competitive. Anybody out there real competitive? Smack talkers. Little Baker Mayfield maybe in Elijah here who wants to get in the face. And look at what he does. Look at what he says. He says, "Maybe your God is occupied." Now that translates poorly to this audience. If you've ever been to a festival downtown or state fair and you have to powder your nose and you go to that green door and you need to step in to powder your nose and it says occupied on the door? That's what he was saying. Basically, he says, maybe your God's having to go powder his nose. And if it isn't that, if he isn't taking a potty break, maybe he's taking a vacation. Maybe that's the problem. Your God's on vacation. Or it could be that your God's taking a nap, sleeping on the job. He's rubbing their face in it. And then, look at verse 28. They became even more fervent about the lie. They cried with a loud voice. They cut themselves according to their customs with swords and lances. Their blood was gushing out on them. And when the midday was past, and it was now into the time of the evening sacrifice, listen to this, listen to verse 29. There was no voice. There was no one who answered. Their lie has been exposed. I remember the voices that spoke into my life when I was the age of our middle schoolers and high schoolers. I remember the voices telling me, man, if it was at the right party on the weekends, if I had the right car in the driveway, if I had the right girl on my arm, if I had the right stuff, that I would know happiness. And I listened to those voices. I bought into those lies. I went down that path that was wide that most people were on. And I woke up as a junior in high school and realized that was a dead end. That my life was going nowhere, even though I had everything I'd ever dreamed for. But there was something missing. And that path was destroying my life. And while everybody was applauding and everybody was celebrating and everybody was supposedly smiling on the outside, none of us had an answer on the inside. Same was true for Israel that day. The things of this world will never satisfy you. No matter how pretty it looks, no matter how attractive and alluring it might be, it will never answer the deepest needs you have. But here's the sad part of verses 28 and 29. As you look at verses 28 and 29, here's the sad thing about this story. I look at these 850 crazy lunatics, these false prophets, and I realize that they were more committed to their lie. They were more committed to their lie than we are to the truth. I mean, they were all in. To the point where they're cutting themselves. In front of the whole nation, they were willing to say, I'm committed to my God, even though it was a dead, false God. And here's Israel. Here's Israel, who has a history of walking with the supernatural God. The one who has split the Red Sea, the one who has given them victory over giants, the one who's given them their promised land, the one who has worked miracle after miracle after miracle. And what do? They sit on their little church chair and they remain silent. Could it be that the problem in America today is not the paganism of our culture, but the silence of the church? Could it be that it falls at our feet, that we aren't even more radically committed to that which is eternally true? We get to verse 30, and it's Elijah's turn. We're going to come back next Sunday. We're going to run out of time today, but next Sunday we will talk about the importance of this timing, the evening sacrifice. But look at verse 30. In that evening time, that time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." And all the people came in. All of a sudden, there was a humbling going on in Israel. This God Baal, who they had been looking to, this God that they had started to worship, remained silent. Elijah, one man, the power of God, takes his stand. They all draw in and look at what Elijah did next. "Come near to me." All the people came near. And he cut off the head of Ahab. Whoo, that'd make a cool Avengers movie, wouldn't it? That'd be sweet. Bring in the king. Off with his head. Time for the liar to die. That's what a warrior would do. But Billy Sunday said something very powerful. He said, before we can be God's warriors, we must become God's worshipers. And I want you to see it. Look at the very first thing that Elijah does. As they came near to him, he didn't give a famous sermon. He didn't cry out for the blood of the king. But he repaired the altar of the Lord. That altar which had been torn down. I would say to you, if we're going to be the generation of Elijah, we need to do what Elijah did. That we raise up and take our stand. But as we take our stand, it starts by first taking our knee. That we return to our altars. And here we find this picture. What they had once worshiped on this mountain, they had worshiped the one true God. That altar where they had gathered before and offered their sacrifices out of years of neglect and abandonment and false gods coming in and wiping out what was true. Elijah steps in and he begins to repair and rebuild the altar. You see, I think what's missing in America today is not another church on another corner. What's missing is His church on its knees at the altar. And so while there's a lot more to this story, we're going to have to pick it up next week. The first service, God just said, it's time to put on the brakes. I'm done, and that's where we need to stop today. And what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to do what Elijah did. And it may not be normal for you. It wasn't normal for Israel. It may not be comfortable for you. It wasn't comfortable for them. But you know what Elijah modeled? Elijah brought everybody together around the altar and he said, guys, we need to go back to this place. We've got to return and repair the altar, and we've got to once again return to the one true God. Before we ever see revival, before Israel ever saw revival, it started with the altar being rebuilt. So I want you to bow your heads with me, if you would. And I want you to absorb all of this in, because our day is no different than Elijah's. We too live in a nation that once was a nation living for God, just like Israel. But we wake up today and our nation is just like it was here in 1 Kings 18. A stiff-necked, stubborn people who've become so proud and so filled of itself that we have declared we no longer need the one true God. We have invited every form of evil into the streets, the cities, the homes of this nation. We have neglected our altars. We go to church, we go to camp, but daily we've neglected our altars. You can get mad at what's happening. You can get mad at different interest groups. You can get mad, or you can get right with God. Before we leave this place today, before we rush out into this world cloaked in darkness, I want to challenge you to repair your altar. And you say, what does that mean? I don't even know what an altar is. If you've never entered into a relationship with God, it could be somebody worshiping online, it could be somebody right here this morning. Maybe your first step is into a relationship with God. But I want to speak to the majority of the people in this room, knowing that many of you know the Lord, just like Israel, but you're not walking with Him. You've allowed your altar to be neglected. I'm going to ask us all who can. If you can't do this, maybe you had a recent knee surgery, or you may have an injury that doesn't allow you to get on your knees. But I'm going to encourage you to do something we don't do often enough. I want you to, if you're comfortable, if you can, to just make your chair your altar right now. Just get on your knees all over this room. Let's go to our knees, if you can. If you want to do that here at the front, if some of you want to come together and pray at this altar, this symbolic altar here at the front of the stage, you can join me down here at front. But before we leave, before we go on in the story of Elijah, we need to do what Elijah modeled. We need to get on our knees and repair the altar, that place where we meet and commune with God. And you need to cry out to God over your family altar or over your personal altar and say, God, forgive me. God, make this altar fresh again, my walk with you. God, make it fresh. Return me to my first love. However you need to pray. Then I'm going to ask our staff if they would make their way here to the front, just in case there's a need in the room, a spiritual need. Maybe you need a church family. Maybe you just need somebody to pray over you. Maybe you need a relationship with God. We have our staff here waiting. If you need to come during this time, step over those who are praying. Make your way here to the front. Alex is going to sing over us. You repair your altar right now. Just talk to God.
I'm Cameron, you're watching Connection Points, and here's what's going on this week at PCBC. We have some very exciting news for you this morning. VBS registration opens today. Make sure you get your kiddos signed up as it comes up on June 24th through 28th. You can register at pcbckids.tv. Parents, don't forget about our Kids Night Out, Parents Night Off event we have coming up on June 8th. If you want to join us for that, head on over to pcbc.tv/events and let us know. Learning Tree. Enrollment is now open. If you are a preschooler, have a preschooler, or know a preschooler, head on over to pcbckids.tv to find out information about that and how you can be a part of our awesome program.
Men's Breakfast is happening on May 29th at 6 a.m. in room 155, and you can register online at pcbc.tv/events. It's only $3. You don't want to miss out. Pastor Sean is starting his class on the book of Revelation back up starting on June 13th. It's going to be at 6:30 p.m. in room 144, and everyone is invited to attend as we dive deeper into our understanding of a pretty intense book of the Bible. And today we are officially rolling out the scholarship board for both Falls Creek and Cross Timbers. Church family, you have always done such an incredible job at giving to send our students and kids to camp. We are very excited to give you yet another opportunity to do that. So make sure you pop by the scholarship board in the lobby on your way out today. This has been Connection Points. My name is Breland. We hope you have an awesome week, and we will see you soon.